Hello, everybody. My name is Pete Van Deusen. I am the founder of Brain Trainer International. Been working in the field here for about 30 years. And Brain Trainer International is a company that has distributors in the European Union, in Brazil, in Latin America, Australia, and Oceania. And we here in the United States pretty much handle the US and Canada. We have hundreds and hundreds of trainers, both professionals and home trainers, who have been working with us since 2002 when we began producing and teaching people how to use our packages to allow trainers to train their brains at home, as well as having professionals who use our system as well. Today, we're going to look at the issue of homeschooling, which is something that is a growing area of interest in the United States and Canada and some other parts of the world as well, and which I suspect with the lockdown and some of the things that will be following on from that may very well become a much bigger topic and something that's much more active in the time to come. We know that people who talk about changes in the economy that will follow on from this process of shutting everything down are essentially saying that more and more people are going to be doing do-it-yourself types of approaches, whether they're fixing things in their homes or taking care of their children or training their brains or whatever. And we've seen a growth in our business in that area over a number of years. So let's talk about home training and particularly homeschooling and how those two can fit together. To begin with, let's talk for a second about what is homeschooling. Initially, it was sort of primary education for, in many cases, kids who were not going to daycare or things like that. But over a number of years, it's grown to include both primary and secondary education. So there are children who are schooled at home all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade. In many cases, those children may be trained completely at home, either using resources from outside, sometimes from the school itself, sometimes from contract agencies. And with the increasing growth of the internet, there are lots of trainers or teachers and tutors who offer online support in a variety of academic areas to specifically help people that are doing homeschooling. Some people will use homeschooling only in particular areas and send their kids to schools for other areas. And to a large extent, it's pretty much something that's approved around the country, although the level of bureaucracy you have to deal with can be different based on what states you're in. Okay, and by the way, one of the things that's more recent is that the growth of what we see now are homeschooling university degrees, where it's possible for a person to continue to work from home and go ahead and get a bachelor's degree. Some places even offer post-grad degrees. So let's take a look at how the system has grown. In 1999 is the first number I could find for number of people who are being homeschooled in the United States, and that was 850,000. 4 years later, we had an increase of about 250,000, a quarter of a million in 2003, up to 1.1 million. In 2007, 4 years after that, the number was calculated to be at 1.55 million. So again, a little over 400,000. And 2012, it was 1.7 million, almost 1.8 million. And the latest number I've seen was in 2017, 2.3 million students from kindergarten to 12th grade who are currently using homeschooling as their primary school approach as opposed to public or private schools. It'll be very interesting to see the effects of the lockdown. First of all, because many children were kicked out of their schools back in March. And so they were affected by not being able to complete their school years. And since many parents also were laid off or lost their jobs and had kids at home with nobody to take care of them now, a number of people who had not previously been doing home-based schooling began doing it, at least temporarily, and learned about it and found out how it worked and whether they liked it or not. Now that we see a number of people talking about starting school up in the fall, but having children required to wear masks and gloves in school all day long, and also not being able to play together or eat together in the cafeteria. That I have to maintain the 6-foot distance. I think some families that I've talked to are really not particularly excited about the idea of going back to that kind of a school. In addition, one of the things that a lot of people talk about as being a positive of this lockdown is that families have been forced to spend more time together, have had the opportunity to spend more time together, and have sort of increased in their connectedness. It's not a bunch of people who are all running off to different places in the morning and then coming back together briefly at night, spending time on their smartphones and their computers and then going to bed. There will also likely to be a change in the number of jobs, the quality of jobs that are available, at least in the near future. And that may very well lead some parents to decide that they're interested in doing the homeschooling as opposed to sitting around the home and having their kids go off to school. One of the other issues, interestingly enough, that's been a major impact on homeschooling is that there are a lot of people in this country, or at least a significant minority, who are not in favor of forced vaccination of their children, especially as the number of things that we're being vaccinated for goes up and up and up. So far, New York and California have very recently removed the ability for parents to choose whether their children would be vaccinated if they were homeschooling or if there was some religious reason for preferring not to do it. So now essentially all children in those states must be vaccinated. And that is leading some people to look at leaving those places. The history of homeschooling is an interesting one because from basically the first people who came to North America from Europe up through the 1850s, most people were schooled at home. We all know the story of Abraham Lincoln learning by the fireside, using chalk and a blackboard to learn his letters and math and so forth. But most of the founding fathers and many of our presidents and leaders, national leaders, as well as people like Thomas Edison and many others later on, were in fact homeschooled. The tendency was in those days to really focus on classical education, looking at literature, looking at history, learning math, and so forth. Massachusetts in the early 1850s began pushing toward having state-run schools. And and requiring, I think around 1857, they began requiring, they had what they called truancy laws, so that they could require children to attend public schools and track them and force them to do so if they chose not to. Department of Education was formed in 1867, making education sort of a state-run process. The idea in this period, actually starting in the late 1780s and 90s, the move toward an industrial revolution with mass production and people living in cities instead of on farms and so forth, that created the concept of the state being the most important body. In the United States, prior to that, it was individual states, not the federal government. And so we began to see, even in places like Europe, where they still had kings, the states began to be formed, the countries, and they began to have an interest which they recognized was very involved with education. Education from the beginning has not only been an issue of teaching, but also one of socialization, creating good citizens. As we moved further into the 1800s, of course, more people, as I said, left the farms, moved into the cities. So bigger schools began to be formed. And essentially what we talk about as assembly line education, that is that you have a small number of workers and you produce a large number of objects, namely students, children, became a value. Of course, one of the difficulties with the assembly line is that you lose individuality. People pretty much have to conform to whatever it is the assembly line is producing. Well, that became an issue in the 1970s with the revolution that started with the baby boomers. First of all, the idea that children had to have a job, and that job was going to school. They went to school every morning with their lunch pails, just like their dads and moms did, if they worked outside in factories, and they stayed there until the bell told them they could come back home, and then they had stuff that they had to do when they got back home. So that a majority of the time that children spent was not necessarily with their families, it was with proxy parents. Those were their teachers. The teachers were the people who did a lot of the education, not only didactic education, but also teaching people about what it meant to be a good citizen and so forth. One of the things that, as a result of that, particularly as a result of the state being involved, was that children were taught to be institutionalized. They learned that they were supposed to work in institutions and in organizations, and they had to follow the rules. And so the idea of individual values being important really went way down, and increasingly there were issues related to the culture that became part of the school. The Pledge of Allegiance and many things like that were part of the school because at that time that was a value in our country. Ivan Illich was one of many thinkers at that time who really wrote a lot about the school systems and how they were really not beneficial to the development of young people. Illich said that basically the school system taught conformity. If you can remember when you were in school, or if you have children in school now, you know that the important thing is not necessarily what you know, but how you know how to do things. So one of the things that's very frustrating for parents and for a lot of children is that children whose brains are able to process mathematically very quickly, almost intuitively, will answer all the questions on a math test correctly and get a 0 because they didn't show their work. In other words, you have to learn how to do your calculations the way the teacher teaches you, not necessarily what is the most efficient way for you. And certainly creative solutions to problems and creativity in general are not things which the school system reinforces. In fact, in many cases, it sort of blocks it. Also, children are taught very early on that there is this system of grading, that there is a system where you're at the top of the list or you're at the bottom of the list or whatever in various different areas. And that's something which is academically very positive, but in terms of how people actually operate in the real world, it's not necessarily so useful. Entrepreneurs, for example, really usually don't do very well in that kind of a setting. And many people learn to categorize themselves based on that model of progress. So one of Illich's most well-known phrases was, the right to learn is actually curtailed by obligation to attend school. There are systems like Montessori and others that for decades and more than that have allowed children to learn in a more open way, in ways that work with them. And those approaches tend to be very, very successful, but not available to many people because they're expensive. Also, because children spend the great majority of their time not with their families, not with necessarily their parents, but with a peer group that judges them and guides them in terms of how they're supposed to behave and act and look and what clothes they wear and what they listen to and what they believe. So peer-based socialization starts at a very early age. And this is one of the things that was a major issue in the 70s and early 80s. In the 1980s, there was a stronger move toward homeschooling that really began to take off, and that was primarily run by or dominated by religious groups, by born-again Christians and evangelicals and so forth, who wanted to have the child's education include an orientation to religious values and awareness of how their religion worked and how it applied to the world around them. However, in the last few years, the last decade or more, we've seen that the homeschooling population has moved into secular groups as well as other religious groups. Of course, there for a long time have been Catholic schools and schools that were actually owned by and run by religious orders. But for people who couldn't take advantage of that, homeschooling was an option. The most recent studies have basically demonstrated that that population for whom the primary reason that they homeschool is because of their desire to include religious and spiritual issues in the education is dropped down to about 36%. So close to 2/3 of the people who are homeschooling may be including those issues in what they do, but that's not their primary reason. The biggest issue in the most recent studies that related to why people decided to homeschool was concern about the school environment. And very interestingly, I have a brother who was a teacher for pretty much his entire professional life. I have one of his sons is a teacher, and I've got a nephew who's a teacher, another nephew who's a teacher, and all of them have essentially the same concerns about the school environment that homeschoolers have. Very common when you talk to teachers off the record. They'll be concerned about things like the quality of the school environment, how much of it is bureaucracy, how much of it is actually about the quality of education. That's something which many studies have raised questions about the results that we get from the school systems, the public schooling systems. And now the idea of socialization, where among other things, there are stories of children who are 6 years old and 7 years old being taught as a part of the curriculum that there is no such thing as boys and girls, and that they should not consider themselves to be boys or girls, raising an issue which is probably way early in a child's life to have to think about issues of gender and so forth. But because that's something which is an important issue for some in our society, it's actually being pushed into the school systems. And so, but also issues of discipline, issues of violence, and many other things are concerns that lead parents to decide that they want to move into a place where they have a greater control of the education of their children and the development of their children. And as a result of the changes in the internet, especially probably over the last 10 years, there have been a lot of resources that have been developed that can be used remotely so that parents who choose to homeschool are able to access very, very good teachers online and courses, especially in specialty areas like mathematics, some in history, so that the parent doesn't have to create an entire lesson plan and learn everything or relearn everything about some of the best ways to teach some of these subjects. They can actually use resources that are available, some of them for free, most of them for fairly reasonable amounts, up to and including entire courses for children of a particular age. In fact, some of the charter schools, which have been very successful in terms of academic outcomes, also use or produce those kinds of resources. In the beginning, for up till the early 80s, pretty much it was not legal to homeschool your child. Between 82 and 93, Nevada and Utah, which were the only states which did fully allow homeschooling, 34 more states changed their laws in order to make it available to those people. And by the time we got to 1993, really only Michigan, North Dakota, and Iowa still didn't allow it to be legal. Now, however, it is legal to homeschool in all 50 states, but each of the states has its own requirements in terms of how you demonstrate that you are doing something appropriate, how you test to make sure that your children are doing okay, what curriculum you're teaching, and so forth. The issue has gone to court a number of times, and the Supreme Court has ruled that parents have a fundamental right to control the values and curriculum of private education of their children, free from state interference. Key word there is private. So they can consider working at home with their student as a private school, and therefore theoretically free from state interference. Not completely, but that sort of depends on the state. The standardized tests, which have been used, by the way, to compare results of homeschooling compared to public schooling in heavily regulated states that have all kinds of strong requirements in terms of curriculum and reporting and all of those kinds of things, really don't do any better than the states that are the least regulated. So there's no valid reason in terms of outcomes for states to make it more difficult to homeschool, but unfortunately that is the reality. What's really interesting is if we look at schooling as being something where we want to be able to educate people, then it makes sense to look at how well people get educated in private schools, homeschools versus public schools. And here we're going to talk about one of the major issues, one of the major concerns that probably to some extent drives regulation. That is that there are two types of homeschooling situations. One which is called structured, that is, the parent actually has a plan. There is a regular period of time that they meet. There are perhaps external things that are done besides just studying. And they may be using resources either from some public schools or online resources or groups of parents who get together and have a tutor that helps them and so forth. So let's look at some of the results of outcomes. First of all, there was a study done with matched groups of children 5 to 10 years old from structured homeschools versus public schools in 5 of the 7 academic test areas which were graded. The structured homeschool students were actually a whole grade level or more better than those who went to public schools. These were matched in terms of parents' education, in terms of income level of the parents, in terms of race, in terms of whatever issues might have been considered to be confounding variables. The structured homeschool students were a half year ahead in math and slightly better in reading comprehension. The unstructured homeschools came in last. They did worse than the public schools in all of the academic measures. So if someone's considering homeschooling, it's very clear that you need to be willing to make the commitment to following a structured system. And there are tremendous resources available via the internet, via magazines, via groups or around the country to help people get started and to make them aware of the options for structured homeschooling. There was a study done in 1999 with 20,000 students who they compared structured homeschooling with public schools. The median score for the homeschool students in a variety of different measures was 70 to 80th percentile. That means that 70 to 80% of the other children in the same age group scored worse than they did on the test. There is another study back in 2017, jumping down a little bit, was a meta-analysis which actually looked at all the studies that could be found that were well designed and published, comparing how standardized tests demonstrated the effect of structured homeschooling versus the public schools. The standard homeschooling children on the average or of the mean, the median, I believe, of this one was that those students scored in the 65th to the 80th percentile. So they were better than 2/3 to 4/5 of children their age, whereas the public schools scored in the 50th percentile. That is, they were average relative to other people. other children of the same age. In 2010, there was a comparison made of structured homeschooling versus public schooling, which showed that comparing college-bound students who came out of homeschooling, and by the way, people who have gone through structured homeschooling have been admitted to Harvard, to Princeton, to the service academies, to some of the highest and most demanding schools in the country. 66.7% of those who were structured homeschoolers graduated compared to 57.5% who came out of the public school system. And the structured homeschoolers also had higher grade point averages. The 2014 study showed that the structured homeschoolers had higher SAT scores than all college-bound students. So in other words, comparing them against people who had gone through the public school system, on average, they were significantly better in terms of their SATs. And study that pulled together information from studies in 2008 to 2013 showed that structured homeschoolers beat public school people in their knowledge of math and their performance of math in all the various different tests that were used and in each one of those years. So pretty clearly, the benefit of individualized education, small class sizes, and working with a teacher who's motivated by family ties as well as by a job has an effect, a positive effect on people's learning. There are other results which have been interesting that have been demonstrated. There is a set of adaptive behavior scales, a study using those to look at how mature and well adapted children were. The structured homeschools came out with their children in the 84th percentile. 84% of the population, or 83% of the population of children, were not as mature or well adapted as the people who were homeschooled. 23% of the 23rd percentile was the result from the public schools. So there's a huge difference in the development of the child in a situation where he or she is really sort of central to the process as opposed to a piece of the product that's being produced by the assembly line. In a 2012 study, people who were doing structured homeschooling were found to be much better able to converse with adults than those who went to public schools. When you go to public school, you rarely actually talk much to an adult. The adult talks to you and you listen. Whereas at home, you're basically conversing with your teacher, who is also your parent or your tutor. And you also are more likely to be able to connect with adults outside the home in your schooling experience. So instead of having the child that comes home at the end of the day and you say, you know, how was your school? And they say, and that's okay. That's what you leave it at. Schooling is more of a topic with homeschoolers, talking about how things are going and what we did today and what we learned today, all of those kinds of things. The structured homeschoolers also demonstrated a greater sense of self and a sense of their independence versus the need to conform to their peers. Makes sense because essentially it's the self who's doing the training and you're working directly with an adult versus being most of the time with your classmates and worried about where you fall in that population of people. Another thing that's very interesting is that in structured homeschooling, the academic work is generally somewhere around 3 to 4 hours a day. So the child is not getting up early in the morning, getting on a school bus or being driven to school, and then sitting around in a homeroom or whatever, waiting for school to start, changing from one place to another, depending on bells, and then having hours where in order to get the assembly line to work properly, there are always some students who are sort of wasting time, and then traveling back home again. So children are often away from home for 7 or 8 hours during a day, which is nice for the parents who are working. But in that time, they basically get 3 to 4 hours of education and not individualized education. So that means that a child who's homeschooling has a lot more freedom to do other things. Those things can be reading or going on field trips or watching movies or whatever, doing projects, but the child, or going out and playing, having fun. Those are things which are a real plus in terms of child development, comparing structured homeschooling versus public schools. Much greater sense of connection with the family because you're in the family pretty much all day. So hopefully that in the family situation, especially if the parents are motivated to say, we want to take responsibility for the education of our child, that's a good thing. And issues with structured homeschooling students, there's a clear demonstration that the likeliness of them to smoke or to use drugs is way lower than it is in people who go to the public schools. Reasons for people to choose homeschooling. This is based on several studies. About 25%, the school environment was considered to be an important issue. Certainly, there were a number of places where people expressed objections to the content of the classes and even to the curriculum. That one of the things that you become clear on now, you can watch on YouTube a variety of people from Jay Leno to others who have gone out on the street and found young people, high school graduates, people who are in college graduates, and ask them a series of questions like, who won the American Revolution, or things like that. And it's just astonishing to see these people who have been educated by the public system who have no idea what the answer to that is. So there is a question about how much real American history is taught, or at least how American history is taught, what we learn about our country, what we learn about our culture and so forth, how that has changed over the years. And many parents are not happy with that as well. So there are the socialization issues, there are the political issues, which are increasingly a part of the school system, as well as the curriculum. But also critical are issues like bullying. There really isn't bullying or violence in homeschools, at least there shouldn't be. Sexualization, the number of children who are together, the fact that children are really not very supervised, except when they're in the classroom sitting quietly and listening to the teacher. A lot of material, especially with the internet making things so available, makes it into what people learn in their peer groups. So we see, looking at just the way that young children dress, and their orientation toward how they relate to the opposite sex or to their own, those are frequently seen as being things which are inappropriately early in the life of a child. Issues of drugs and alcohol, obviously, those issues are in school systems because there are children in those systems who have older brothers and sisters, who have parents, and so they bring those things into the public school. The dissatisfaction with academic instruction. This is another thing, by the way, the first issue is one where in many cases the public school teachers will tell you the same thing, that they are cops as opposed to teachers in many cases, because they have to try to manage the classrooms, which are filled with people who are not very socialized and not very mature, and who are bringing issues outside of education into the classrooms, but also the fact that they're supposed to now be teaching things which don't really have to do with the reading, writing, and arithmetic curriculum. Dissatisfaction basically has to do with the fact that smaller class sizes, obviously the class size might be one if you're homeschooling, or it might be a couple of children in a family, or it might be several families who go together and bring their kids together to work in a homeschool situation with one or several of the parents involved. That's very, very important. We know that that is an effect that improves education. If it's individualized, then each person learns in his or her own way, and the training and the teaching can be done based on the individual learning styles. Also, since the homeschoolers tend to be using a curriculum which is focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and literature, as opposed to racial studies or sexual studies or any of the other things that might be appearing now, certainly are in universities, the students are much more aware of and able to recall and use information about those actual subjects as they grow older. In some cases, one of the important issues still for many people who homeschool is the desire to include religious values in their education. When the child is at school for 8 hours a day and the mom and dad basically get them off to school in the morning and then catch them at the end of the day when they're tired and just want to have a little bit of time to be able to do things that they enjoy or to get back together with their peer group on gaming or whatever, those values often are available when you go to church once a week, if you do, and then they're not necessarily integrated into the way a person learns to deal with life. So for those for whom that's an important issue, homeschooling offers an opportunity to really integrate those issues into the educational process. Also, there are children who have physical issues, who have mental issues, or who have very different learning styles. And in the schools and the public schools, they will tend to be separated off into special education groups where their ability to really learn very much is limited. Primarily, the teachers in those situations are responsible for trying to keep order in the classroom and get through as much as they can, but still with more students than they can actually do that with. So if the child is being schooled at home, then the physical issues can be dealt with. There are no issues of stigmatization from other students. Same thing with people who have difficulty with attention, with impulse control, with anxiety, or any of those kinds of things. And we'll talk more about how brain training can be integrated into the school system when you're training at home, whereas trying to get it into most public schools is a massive bureaucratic undertaking and rarely is successful. And the ability to focus on how a child learns so that they learn more effectively is something that can be focused on at home. One of the newer things that we're seeing, and I suspect we're going to see grow a lot in the next couple of years, is the issue of home university, homeschooling for a university degree. The issues in the public universities and the private universities related to how people are treated and what the values are in the university has become an issue that a lot of people are aware of, especially when their kids go off to school. The fact that the universities, which used to be bastions of free speech, are now heavily censored so that people who don't toe whatever the line is that the university believes is what everyone should believe literally are not allowed to speak. And if they are invited to come and speak, then students, with the support of the faculty and the administration, will literally shout them down so that their opposing points of view can't be listened to. Another big issue is that any of us who have worked with real trauma, children and adults who have experienced trauma in the sense that we usually talk about it, are now sort of being lumped together with people who claim to have been seriously traumatized by hearing an opinion that they didn't agree with. So the concept of trauma and the fact that the university then says, well, we have safe spaces, we won't allow anybody to say things that might hurt your feelings or might upset you, that seems to be almost the opposite of what education was originally understood to be. So those are things which are leading many families and in some cases students to consider whether or not going to a university and getting into that environment is really the way that they want to continue their education. Worse than that, or equal to it at least, is that the cost of a university education has become absolutely absurd. It's grown much faster than the cost of living, and it hasn't grown because of an increase in the quality of education. In fact, as I mentioned above, there's question about whether the quality of education may actually have gone down at the same time the cost has gone up. So the result of the very high prices has been that we have a whole generation of students, perhaps more than one, who are leaving schools having completed a degree or not having completed a degree, who have absolutely massive levels of debt, because it's very easy for them to borrow money, not from banks anymore, but literally from the federal government, so that a child may well, or a young adult may well leave school owing $100,000 or more and having a degree in white studies or black studies or women's studies, which have fairly limited applications in terms of getting income. So it becomes something where a whole generation of people are in a position where they can't buy a house, they can't afford to think about being married, they can't afford to think about having children. They basically live in their parents' basements, the sort of stereotype, and play video games all day. So those are things which have really raised a lot of questions, including the fact that there are lots of people working at McDonald's who have university degrees in a variety of different subjects, some which would not be considered to be political degrees, but you know, the old liberal arts degree or degree in math or something like that, who can't find jobs, and so they end up working wherever they can. As a result, there has been an increase. There are now actually several universities which are completely online. They don't have bricks and mortar. Their teachers produce their coursework online. The students can do it at their own convenience, where they want to, when they want to, so that they can work or they can have a family and be getting their degree in a variety of different topics and subjects, and doing it for a dramatically lower cost, so that they leave the university with something that hopefully is useful, ideally something that they've been able to be working in during the time that they were going to school, so that they were getting actual experience and without a huge amount of debt. But more recently, we see that many of the private and public universities now offer online degrees. So what we have is a tremendous number of places where a person can get a degree from Purdue, from Harvard, from University of Florida, from many other institutions, which are completely done online. They still have access in many of those universities to the placement services that the universities offer to students who go through the courses at the university. So in terms of helping to find jobs and things like that, they have that benefit as well. They don't have the cost of tuition, at least nowhere near as high. They don't have housing costs. They don't have the fees and so forth. So even the cost of tuition and getting back and forth to school and so forth is usually significantly less. And they're able to focus on their education as it relates to the things they need to learn, their coursework, as opposed to having to deal with all of the social and political issues that seem to be dominant in many universities today. There certainly are sources that produce resistance to homeschooling. One of the strongest of those is the teachers' unions. Teachers' unions essentially continue, even in the face of the facts and the studies that I spoke of earlier, continue to argue that homeschool children don't get as good an education as they would if they went to the schools. And so they form a very strong lobby, which results in a political resistance, at least among some groups, to the opportunities for parents to do what the Supreme Court says they can do, which is to make choices as to the values and education systems that their children are afforded. Voucher systems have been suggested for a long time, and they are consistently voted down when they come up, because that would allow students, and particularly their parents, to choose the school that their children would go to and apply what they spend in taxes for the public school system to choose for the school system that they wanted to use. Lots of stories on how charter schools are becoming extremely powerful and popular, because they get so much better results than the public schools, and often for much less money per per student. But unfortunately, especially families that are lower income families that really have a commitment to trying to get their children out of the cycle and get them a good education, allow them to move ahead, they have to get into the lottery systems for the charter schools that are available. And if they are lucky, the child gets in. And if not, the child is stuck pretty much with what are often even subpar public schools in their own areas. The public school bureaucracies obviously are not in favor of homeschooling. They are required to provide some support to parents who homeschool, but it's sort of done grudgingly in many cases. And many of the experts who are involved in the field of education continue again to say that there's no way that schooling done by a parent at home who doesn't have a master's in education and so forth can possibly compete with the results that a public school can get. Again, despite the fact that that is contradicted by the actual facts that have been discovered in studies. So there are some important things that a person considering homeschooling needs to take into account. And so people who are either just starting off with their children in school or people who are looking at how the lockdown is going to change what their options are and what decisions they might want to make in 2020. Here are some of the things that are considered to be very important to consider. And again, if you do a search on the internet, you'll find a number of state organizations of homeschoolers, national organizations of homeschoolers, magazines, lots of books, as well as online programs that can help you sort of go through and make a decision about whether that's something you want to consider. So the structured approach as opposed to the unstructured, as we talked about earlier, is crucial. If you're not planning, if you're just planning to say, I'm not going to send my kid to school, I'll just keep him at home, we'll watch TV, we'll read a book every once in a while or something like that, then don't do it. The public education will still beat what you can do with no education. But a structured approach where you actually have a plan for what subjects you're going to teach, what the child's going to know at the end of the training period, how you're going to provide the information and so forth, that's very important. And that's an area where there's a lot of resource available to you. So researching the curriculum options is a very important place to start in terms of figuring out how much is it going to cost me to do this, and is it going to cost me anything? So you have the free systems. There are free curriculum systems, some of which appear to be very good, and some of which are sort of, like anything that's free. They may have some benefits, but not necessarily of the highest quality. There are a variety of paid systems, some coming from the schools themselves, and some things like the online schools, which pull together very good teachers and produce coursework so that you have someone who does the didactic stuff, and then the parent can work with the child in actually implementing it, helping the child to understand it, being able to pause the presentation and work with the child to make sense of it and talk about what they're learning and so forth. Those are continuing to grow, and some of them, in doing the research for this, I found several really amazing systems for subjects like math, where there are excellent teachers who provide really incredible education and teaching that really orient toward bringing children along and teaching them math, as opposed to what often happens is that you sit in a classroom and a teacher starts going through algebra or geometry or whatever. And if the child doesn't get it, or if they're going in and out of contact because of attention problems, it simply flies over their head. If they don't do their homework at home, they're lost. They don't know what's going on. So those things are available. And in many cases, schools work with parents who decide to do homeschooling for certain subjects, send this child to school for other subjects, and they even have in a number of schools what are called advanced placement courses, where a student who is moving ahead very well, ahead of the curve in math or in history or in language or whatever, those children can join those courses, can test into them, and actually be earning college credits while they're still in high school, so that they're ready to go to college with a little bit of a head start. Those things are all available now, which weren't necessarily available 10 years ago. And I'm guessing that, as I suspect we'll see homeschooling increase in the fall, I expect also that there will be increases in the options that are available to parents who decide to homeschool. The other thing to really consider is that one of the great benefits of homeschooling is that you can actually take the child out of the classroom and learn things that you've been learning didactically in the real world by integrating the real world experience with what you learned in school. Taking trips to see things, see places, and taking tours of museums and going to libraries and many other things that can be integrated into the homeschooling experience and make it more interesting to both the student and to the teacher. So let's talk for a second now about the reason that I'm interested in this. We have for a number of years had homeschoolers as a part of the population that we worked with who are doing home-based brain training. And we found that that is an extremely powerful opportunity to help a child improve even more the outcomes that they get. First of all, one of the things that we have to recognize is that in assembly lines, which is what the public schools are, there is a sort of range of people who are acceptable to go through the assembly line. All of us who've been to public schools ourselves know that there are kids who are sort of on the edge of each class and who simply go and sit through the class, but they don't really get anything. And many of those don't complete their high school education, or they complete it, but as I've had clients that I worked with, one in particular that I can recall, who at the age of 18 could not read one paragraph and tell me what the key points in it were. And when we started digging into that, discovered that, in fact, he couldn't read anything. He was 18 years old. He was a senior in high school, and he literally was unable to read. I talked to him about taking notes, but he couldn't write. As a matter of fact, he couldn't really write his own name. This was someone who had passed through year after year after year and gotten all the way through to his senior year in high school and was going to graduate, who was functionally illiterate. So that was a person who managed to sort of slide through, but many who are, because basically he was not a serious problem for the teachers. He didn't disrupt the classroom, but there are children who are more disruptive, uh, who have trouble sitting still for hours and hours in a small room with a whole bunch of other children, and can't really control their impulses to talk to the other children or talk out loud or do things when they feel like them. So those children, as a rule, tend to get identified, and the parents are informed, you need to take this child to a psychologist or to a psychiatrist, you need to get some medication, need to get a diagnosis. And so the child then is sort of pushed out of the mainstream off into one of the sort of side roads. As a result, those children don't do very well, and they also have the issues related to taking psychoactive medications starting very early in their lives. And they also have medical records and education records, which label them with a whole bunch of different kinds of problems. And those records don't change as we get older. There is basically in the public school an unnatural environment and set of expectations for children. Children are expected to be able, from a fairly young age, 6 or 7 years old, to just go into a room with 15, 20, 25 other children. Instead of talking to them, instead of playing with them, instead of any of those kinds of things, they sit individually in a little desk and they sit there for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes at a time while someone talks to them about something that they're supposed to be learning. If they happen to be good at processing language, then they may be able to learn from that. If they aren't so good at that, if they sort of drift away, or if they think with images instead of with language, then they have a difficult time. And there, the adults are not basically their friends. They aren't necessarily even their teachers in the usual sense, because the teachers are put into the role of controlling the classroom. When you talk to teachers, they tell you that's the first thing you learn. Get control of the classroom, maintain control of the classroom, and then do as much teaching as you can while you're handling that. Depending on the social group and the population that you happen to have in your school, that can be a full-time job, and a full-time job which is even perhaps dangerous. So the other issue with the school system, which is to some extent what you would hope would be unnatural, and that is that the child is in a very social situation, and there is a huge amount of stress, if the child cares at all, about getting along with his peers, about doing things that the peers think is cool and so forth, and getting along with teachers who essentially are going to simply be grading and judging how well the person is doing, both in terms of behavior and in terms of academic expectations. So the styles, the processing and learning styles that relate to a specific individual essentially are not accepted. You learn the way we teach, and if you can't do that, you're going to go off onto a side road. Whole brain training, when it's used in a homeschooling environment, is amazing because the two are an ideal fit for one another. First of all, because you're doing 3 or 4 hours a day of educational work, the opportunity to fit in 20 to 40 minutes a day of training, which is something which is not necessarily an educational task, but something where you're basically perhaps watching a movie, you could be reading an ebook, you could be doing a variety of things on the screen and getting feedback to your brain to tell your brain, move a little bit in this direction, move a little bit in that direction. The ability to do that and integrate that into what you're doing with your teaching is very, very easy. And you can do all of that and still come up with extra hours available to the kid and to the parent to be able to do other things. The other thing that's amazing about doing homeschooling and doing it with brain training integrated is that when you train your child at home, for example, and then send them off to a public school, perhaps a teacher will notice that there's been a change. Perhaps the teacher will notice that the child is responding differently, is able to do better in school and so forth. But again, because teachers are essentially in charge of crowd control, they often have to classify and categorize students early in the school year. And when I taught a lot of students back in Atlanta in the early 90s, one of the biggest issues that we ran into was that a student would begin to change so that the parents could see the change happening and the client was aware of it. The trainer could see it happening, but the teacher simply couldn't see it because the teacher automatically knew this kid is a screw up. This kid is not really going to be able to stay settled down. And so there was actually a negative reinforcement on the part of the teacher. Whereas if you are working with your child every day and you're talking to your child about school and about education, you can have the experience. One of the people who I did an interview with for this webinar, we're not going to have enough time, I think, to be able to do the interview stuff here, had her son, who was 15 and was struggling academically, forced to be doing homeschooling as a result of the shutdown. And she was doing brain training, so she started doing brain training with her son, and her son essentially said, no, this is making no difference. No, this is not. This is not. Even though the mom was seeing some improvements in the child, and then because of a course that she had to take out of the home, the homeschooling stopped for 2 weeks. And after 4 or 5 days, her son came to her when she was at home and said, I'm noticing that I'm not doing as well now without the brain training as I was with it. And it was not something he wanted to admit, but he had to admit that it was harder for him than it had been. And even that his friends, who he was only seeing online, were commenting on the fact that he was starting to get crazy again, where he had been sort of moving in a different direction. So that he actually was able to say to his mom, I really think I need to be doing brain training. Let's get back to that. So that's very important. And the mom was seeing things in areas like her son being able to actually converse with her, showing affection to her, which 15-year-olds, young boys don't necessarily do very often. There were clear changes that showed up because they were in contact with each other to a greater degree. So that's very, very helpful. One of our key phrases, one of the things that we say at Brain Trainer, because we don't believe that there's such a thing as a normal brain, and we don't believe in the pathology model that you have this disorder or this disease or whatever. You don't have to be sick to want to get better. And so the idea, one of the great ideas of the in-home system, is that you don't have to say, okay, you're going to have to do brain training because you're a mess, you can't do things very well. Instead, you can say, you know what, this is like going to the gym and exercising, except we're exercising our brains. And it'll make our brains work better in a lot of different ways. And I want to do it too. So there's no reason why the parents can't be doing training. And if there is more than one child in the family, that the children can't all be doing the brain training. It's an exercise program that improves your brain's maturity, improves your flexibility, improves its ability to do things which require greater levels of energy. So it's something which is very valuable in terms of changing the whole dynamic of the family. And because of our payment plans, it's possible to buy these systems for $380 to $450 a month over a period of 4 to 6 months. And at the end of that time, you own it. You have all the hardware, you have all the software, you have the ability to keep working with it, to go back and work with it again later, work with younger children as they're coming up with it. So it's something which you have that is beneficial over a long period of time. So in the homeschooling environment, basically we're saying, as I mentioned, for an individual, somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes per day, 4 or 5 days a week, something that you can usually fit into the schedule, and something which is simple enough that literally older children or adolescents can actually handle the training of their younger brothers and sisters or other children who are participating in the homeschooling. And you can, as I said before, it allows you to, let's see, I think I already did this. No. Track the changes as you go through the schooling. Sorry, cost-effective ownership. Yeah, we talked about that. Individualized. This is an important thing, that with whole brain training, you're working as individually with your student's brain as you are with the learning experience, so that every individual who does the training, the mom, the dad, the children, whoever, those people are working on a custom training plan for their brains. It's individualized. It's not the same thing for everybody. So one person who has difficulty with being very impulsive, another who's anxious, another who is perfectionistic, another one who's distracted by everything going on around them. Those people will all be training their brains to achieve different changes that will make them more successful, not only in the homeschooling environment, not only in the family, but in their lives. So you basically are working to change cognitive capacity, your ability to deal with emotions, your ability to deal with social situations, to track what's going on, to understand the signals that people are giving, to know what's an effective way to interact with other people and so forth, and even spiritual health. Because part of training is always to move you toward a peak state, move you toward the best possible brain you can have. And that involves the ability to be in touch with yourself in every possible way. So last slide, then we'll do some questions. Whole brain training is based on a high definition assessment. We look at anywhere from 12 to 20 different places on each person's brain. And we look at what are the things that person wants to change, and then produce a customized plan. Essentially, if you buy the system, you actually record the data at home using your own system. You send it to us, we process it and send you back the training plans. The hookups are very, very fast and easy. If any of you have ever done brain training and had people putting electrodes on your head or putting caps on and squirting gel into them so you had to take a shampoo every time you finished, that's not the way our system works. The hookup is very fast and easy to do. Children can do it as well as adults. You can do it on yourself. And there's no cleanup because we use salt water. So you have a little bit of salt water on your head. You put the electrodes back in the salt water at the end of a session and you're done. The training sessions are very easy to perform because you can literally open the software, choose which client you want, choose which session you're doing, and then select the protocol, and it will automatically open exactly the training protocol that you want to use. You have the option of changing the feedback that you're going to use, including the ability to get feedback watching Netflix video or watching home videos that you have online or doing work on the internet, any of those kinds of things, as well as some games. And in general, if you do 30 to 40 sessions, so that's going to usually be somewhere between 10 and 15 weeks, or say 3 or 4 months of doing this process, you're going to have you're going to have produced changes in performance, in mood, in ability to learn, in just your knowledge of yourself that are lasting. They're not going to go away. You're not going to have to keep doing the training over and over. Okay, so let me see from Rob whether we have any questions so far, and I'll try to answer those.
Not yet. Does anyone have any questions for Pete? You can enter them in the questions section. Or you can raise your hand. In the attendees section where the attendees are listed, you can click the hand icon.
There's also a chat, I think, that you can.
Yes.
You can go into that and enter a question there if you want to. Just type it in. Let me show you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Pete.
Do you have nothing there yet? Okay. No.
We have a couple here, Pete.
Okay, go ahead.
Tony asks, can I get a specific theta-beta ratio? You mean with the software?
Well, the theta to beta ratio, for those who don't know it, which is probably many of you, is a way that is used to measure how much a brain is working in a creative intuitive state, which is theta, compared to how much it's working in a logical rational state, which is beta. Since it's a ratio, the higher that ratio is, the more the brain is stuck in creative intuitive thought, which is not very popular in the school systems. And the person who has a high theta to beta ratio tends to be thinking pictures and be an image-based processor, whereas a person who has a lower ratio, more dominated by fast speeds, by beta, that person will tend to be very logical, rational, language-based, and will often do better in school. However, I'm not sure how much you know about theta to beta ratios, but the theta to beta ratio can also be too low. People who are anxious or people who are obsessive, people who are perfectionistic, often have too much beta and they can't shift out of it. So they then oftentimes have difficulty paying attention because they're always worried about something. So the theta to beta ratio is one of probably a dozen different things that we look at in the assessment. And if your theta to beta ratio is very high and you have difficulty staying focused on language tasks, or you tend to be very distracted by things, then that would be one of the elements that you would train, would be to change that ratio. But there are many other things that we look at in the brain that are likely to be important as well.
He's asking if he says, I need to train specific frequencies and see the ratio for training.
Well, if you choose not to do whole brain training, if you choose to say, oh, there's just this one thing will fix everything for me, then yes, you could certainly do that. You could say, define what you think theta is, define what you think beta is, or whoever has told you about this and said that that's what you need to do. Define those very easily in the software and train, either train down the difference between the two or train theta down and beta up or whatever it is. But whole brain training is a much more powerful and complete system because very rarely, in my experience, have I seen a person where the theta to beta ratio training that achieved more than temporary results, because it's only a small part of the whole pattern of the way the brain works. But yes, you could do that if you wanted to do that.
Okay, and Keith asks, how would we watch Netflix with the shadow?
You would open your browser and you would start downloading or start playing a video in the in the software, the training software. You would tell the brain what you wanted it to look at, or actually your training plan would actually have a protocol already set up for that, so that let me see if I can figure out how to do this real quickly. Okay. So here's a training screen. And if I go up here to this folder, I can go here and I can say, I want to train Pete. And block 1 would be the first of the 5 sessions that I'm going to rotate through. So I'll say, yes, I want block 1. And then it will tell me here are 3 different trainings that we would recommend for block 1. So this tells me I've got to use the balance 2C, T3, T4 are the sites. These are the reference sites. I'm going to train with eyes closed and eyes open. So that's all you need to know to put the electrodes in the right place. So I'm going to choose this and then I'm going to say load it. And it will now actually load that protocol already set up the way that my training plan has been designed, has been set up for me to train. And I'm going to be decreasing the sum of 2 to 9 hertz and decreasing the difference of 15 to 38 between 2 sites. That's more than you need to know, and you don't need to know that. But if I have a shadow as my feedback, then what I can do is, let's see if I can figure this out. So let's pretend that the webinar here was the video that I wanted to watch instead of being a webinar. I can simply say, okay, I want to click on this icon beside the shadow, and I want to show the shadow, and there's the shadow. I can drag the shadow over, and I can resize it so that it covers the screen that I wanted to watch, which is the webinar. And then I can fix it so it'll stay right there and decide how dark do I want it to get, how light do I want it to get, how smoothly do I want it to move. And as soon as I could also set to have the volume change if I'm watching a movie or not. And now once that's set up, when I actually start doing my training, when I click on the play button, the brain, this is going to look at the sites that I have set up, and it's going to measure the things that I want it to measure. The targets here will set themselves, and as the brain gets closer to where we want it to be, the shadow will become clearer. As it goes in the wrong direction, it'll get darker. So I've got something I can be watching, the webinar or the video or whatever, that will keep my mind involved. But at the same time, my brain is getting information from the shadow, so that my brain is saying, what am I doing that's making that shadow get darker or get brighter? And it's able to learn to change what it's doing that way. Okay, what else?
We have a few specific training questions that I think we can answer off after the webinar.
Okay. Nobody else then that has any specific questions? Okay. Well, very good. I appreciate you guys coming. If you go to the website of brain-trainer.com, on the left side of the homepage, you'll see a link for Brain Trainer U, and there is a free course there that you can join just by putting in your email address and a password, and that will allow you to go through the course called Intro to Brain Training. They're all very short, maybe 5 to 12, 14-minute sections, lessons that you do online, and you'll be able to learn more about brain training, how it works, and why our system works the way it does. And hopefully, if you have any more questions, you can certainly go to the website and click on asking for a consult, send it, and I or one of us will get in touch with you, set up a phone contact or email contact so that we can answer your questions in detail. Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here, and look forward to hopefully working with you guys in the future. Goodbye.